In our first discussion, we talked about life, our motivation for our website and these presentations. In our second presentation, we talked about the three aspects of human life, the body, soul, and spirit. In our third presentation, we explored human values, culture, and institutions. In this, our fourth presentation, we will continue developing our terms of discussion as we explore moral philosophy with you. And more specifically, defining for everyone the difference between absolute morality and relative morality. As you will see, the difference between these two competing belief systems has dogged humanity for thousands of years, and the contention between them has immensely shaped the reality of our cultures and the quality of life as we know it. To begin our discussion, we would like to offer a given, a condition of understanding going forward. Our given is the foundational values that we previously spoke about are by their nature and definition absolute. As we look into our world with the goal of better understanding our humanity, it's invaluable to view the subject from the perspective of a value-driven culture. You cannot possibly understand humanity if you fail to consider how human values, or their opposites, which we refer to as anti-values, impact our lives and the world around us. To best comprehend the inherent complexities of values, people, culture, society, and how it is all interdependent, interwoven in our lives, it is helpful to have a constructive framework to approach the subject. So we're going to provide you with just that, a framework, a frame of reference. To begin our deeper discussion on values, it's relevant to start with a definitive grounding to morality. Morality of the human conscience, of the human mind, of the human soul, of our very being, and around us, the morality of our surrounding society. There are dozens upon dozens of views on morality, and we would have to spend weeks covering them all, and quite frankly, it's really not necessary. There's always a tremendous advantage when sifting through complex material to wrestle it down to some simplicity. We're going to take a look at the two relevant and conflicting moral philosophies of absolute and moral relativity, as these are the most fundamental views. In a few words, morality is about those principles of human thought, choice, and action where we ponder the direction and import of things we think and do or fail to do. Are they right or wrong, and by what standard are we determining the truth and righteousness of our thoughts, decisions, and actions? Is it good or bad? Are we acting nobly or ignobly? Are we acting consistent with love and life or not? Let's take a moment to describe the genuine differences between an absolute moral philosophy and a relative moral philosophy, as the difference is stark and it truly affects how people perceive their worlds and interact with one another. What do people mean in regards to morality when they use the word absolute? Some people cringe when they hear the word. To some, it conjures up feelings of extreme and prohibitive constricting rules and regulation. However, in terms of morality, absolute does not mean those things. It has a very definitive meaning. It's not one of exclusion or ambiguity. On the contrary, it connotes certainty, clarity, and ultimately the greatest inclusion possible in life. Essentially, absolute means beyond the uncertainty and the vagary of humanity. It means set above humankind, set by a supreme being as a reflection of his pure heart and character. Set for humanity as a standard to regard, to guide, to honor, and strive for, regardless of who you are, where you're from, your creed, your race, gender, or perceived worth. Absolute means God's essential truths, a set of truths that exist apart from man, set apart from time, place, and circumstance, set apart from emotions, passions, vagaries of humanity, a set of truths which reflect the true nature of God, a set of truths that are and will forever be for humankind to discern, love, learn, and welcome in their lives. These truths are absolute values and are set forth as a pathway to find eternal life. They are set forth as a standard to be taught and learned. They are set forth as fundamental to guide human thought, develop human conscience, and in so doing, enable maturation of the human soul. Absolute values are from God. As such, they are both perfect and permanently established, created before the dawn of humanity, and they will be with us for all time. Absolute values were created to inspire life for one purpose, bringing life to its fullest potential, clearly calling out the sacredness of life throughout the world. As shared earlier, God has revealed these absolute truths and values to us through the inspired prophets throughout history, fostering a foundation for humanity to build belief systems, share philosophies, and ideologies for the guidance of all people in all lands at all times. It is the intrinsic nature of man to use his mind and to think, to be skeptical, to question, to seek greater understanding, especially when the subject relates to the deepest of life's mysteries. Accordingly, over time, we see the intellectuals gather, discuss, debate, and seek a greater understanding, a more definitive perspective of truth. And such contemplation invariably leads to varying positions, which leads to challenge and many times to change. The thinkers in our society find themselves either accepting or rejecting the notion of God, and consequently either embracing God's inspirations or dispelling them. Such is the nature of man and his hubris. These thoughts of acceptance or change, driven by humility or arrogance, get developed in our civilizations, mostly within the social institutions. There they are encoded into treatises and books, eventually passed among other intellectuals and the educated class for reaction, influence, and dissemination into the overall cultures. Eventually, these documents get passed on through history, across centuries, principally moved through and into humanity, either by the family in the traditions and the heritage of the home, or, most likely, through the primary institutions and the prevailing cultures, namely academia, legal, and communication mediums. As a consequence of man's intellect and reasoning, as a result of man's hubris towards any thought divine and above man, the persistent inquiries have led over time to bold challenges and attacks upon God's inspired absolutes, God's truths, and principles to guide humanity. And as these challenges mature, some thinkers conclude there is no God, and then they further posit, if no God, then there are no absolutes for man. The reasonings continue to establish that God is not the center of life and thought, but instead they must be. Man is the center. Over the centuries, these challenges have led to changes in the recordings and teachings embedded within the cultural institutions. For some, the resolute believers, no changes are necessary, and they act to treasure and preserve God's inspirations. Yet, for the non-believers, they act to purge God and God's words from our culture, and remake them in their own image. And so, we have the birth of moral relativity within the age of man. And so, we have the entanglement of contention upon our beautiful world, an entanglement that does not sharpen human understanding, but confounds it. And so, we have the divergence of human souls away from a path to eternal life, and into a darkness of self-indulgence, and meaningless wandering away from the path that leads to God. Under the mantra of moral relativity, many thinkers, some good, some not so good, have boldly rejected the concept of God. They have dismissed an idea of a supreme and absolute being, the belief of an omniscient, omnipresent, loving deity. They have ruthlessly rejected faith in a single source of all creation and life. Instead, their prideful reasoning has led them away from God and back only into themselves, back only into mankind as the center of everything, and so concluding that man determines for himself what is important and what is not, what is worth considering, worth observing, or not. Everything is an extension of man, relative to man alone, and never to God. This relative philosophy forces a reasoning that concludes everything must be conditional to man, as the center of all thought reality. events, circumstances, his convenience, his nuances in life, making perception of reality conditional to his time, his place, his sentiment, making judgment of reality subject to conditional opinion, both individual and collective. This is what relative morality brings about. This belief in relativity as the organizing principle to morality and our world has over time been carried to greater humanity, blended into the circles of human culture, again and again throughout history as civilizations have risen, as civilizations have fallen, and as civilizations have risen anew. Let's take a brief look at how this happens. It all begins in the outermost circle of humanity's culture, where thoughts and reasoning are bantered about by the world's deep thinkers. In this outer band of culture, where the belief structures, the philosophies, the ideologies are formed, adjusted, and changed, out where the intellectuals reside, the thinkers, the philosophers, theologians, where they think and debate and write, it's in this circle of the culture where the principles are evolved, built, and disseminated inwards to the larger culture. These beliefs, philosophies, and all, once structured, seep into the next ring of the institutions of humanity, absorbed by the professional classes into the religion, academia, and learning, the leadership, the sciences, the economic systems of humanity, down into the codes and purposes of primary institutions, as they are embedded within the social cultures of all peoples across all geographies, among like associations, and many times worldwide. Cascading deeper still, the process penetrates into the next layer of human institutions, blending in and changing human expressions in the arts, literary world, music, law, civics, technology, and communications, filtering into business and industry, governments, and national politics. And it deepens further into our communities, our associations, our world of social media, our workplaces, civic groups, schools, places of organized assembly and worship. Eventually, silting down in and around our families and friends. Eventually, drawing into the most primary of all social institutions in our lives, and the lives of our children, the family unit. In this circle, where we hear from the institutions of our culture, is either reinforcing or challenging to what we have learned through our family and the traditions of our heritage. And to be certain, everything ultimately gets right into the individual, or you or me, at the center of cultural circles of influence. As you can see, the bands encircle and surround their very existence and lives within society, and know very clearly we do get impacted by what our culture and surrounding society resonates through the various institutions. What is said or not said, what is taught or not taught, what is uplifted or dismissed, it all resonates in our lives. Our culture and our society envelops our lives with political and social structure across all aspects of human experience. These circles of culture form a framework upon humanity, and within that structure, life finds its frequency, life develops its beliefs, life contemplates choice, makes decisions, and eventually acts. It is here, within this structure of life, where values can be significantly shaped or inspired, preserved, or altered. It is here where the overlaying web of culture resonates to our individual lives. It is within this matrix fundamental values can be changed, enhanced, or weakened. And when change does occur, it typically happens in one of two ways. Either through God and absolute morality, or through man and relative morality. Change is either driven and influenced by God directly, through God's inspiration to humankind, by ways of seminal events, or directly through the heart and to the mind of humanity. Or change is manufactured and driven by man alone, absent of God, whom the moral relativist does not honor or believe in. When inspiration, guidance, or love is needed, God is there. And God speaks into the soul directly, with love and patience, and the grace of understanding all that is necessary and unnecessary, always infusing pure, life-enabling grace. By God, through man, through inspiration, with man's free will of acceptance and faith, within the human soul triumphing over the human mind. And then outward through the person, out into the surrounding culture, from the heart of man, out into the hearts and minds of others within the family and social institutions, strengthening, enriching others, inspiring them to new insights and purpose. Or it is driven, as relative moralists would have it, through man and man alone, with no acknowledgement of a loving God. This is the second way. Change and influence occurs in moral philosophy within humanity. Only by man and through man, no God is recognized nor accepted. In the second way, change is lessened by the limitations of man's reasoning, opening society to eventual tyranny and chaos, as ambitious men assert their supremacy of their beliefs over all others. In short, setting up every man as the measure of all things throughout every generation. The second way of man alone, in changing fundamental values, is the way of the moral relativist, like a virus. Rejecting God's voice in human affairs, supplanting with man's pride, usurping control of the culture, infecting the institutions, seizing leadership, creating a different message, infecting the minds of humanity, ridiculing absolute moralists, promoting deception, marginalizing people of faith, encouraging agitation, and creating conflict. We want to be very clear on this important distinction. The moral relativists reject God in whole in all the affairs of humankind. The pride and arrogance of the relativists demonstratively seek to push God out of humanity, in so doing creating a godless morality. With relative morality, God in the human soul is not the source of inspiration for change or influence. The moral relativists, working somewhere within the social institutions of our culture, look to embed their thoughts into the institutions. In doing so, they seek to influence humanity by leveraging those institutions atop humanity, inwards towards the individual and families, appealing to the mind of man, exclusive of the soul and spirit. In essence, the moral relativist is drying up the water of our life, the nourishment of the human soul, by pushing God out, chilling, unnerving, but it has not only been happening for centuries, it's happening as we sit here today. And more wearisome, due to our advancement in communication technology, it's happening at an increasing scale, at a greater reach and rate than any other time in the history of humanity. There we have it, the original conflict in belief at the foundation of our culture, either through God and absolute morality, or man and relative morality. It's our choice to decide what to believe in, and how accordingly we want to live our life, and how the tenor of our culture will be around us and our children. Yet make no mistake about it, the choice is one or the other. There is no lukewarm middle ground. As we step back and carefully consider the question of which moral philosophy we most identify with, give some thought to how that choice influences others in our society and shapes their beliefs and thinking, shapes what is important to them or not, developing and refining their values, and influencing how the larger population's actions transfer into the cultural institutions that intersect within our lives each and every day. Cultural institutions for generations forward will carry those human values and principles of human contact for centuries to come, in backing or changing beliefs, in shaping our laws, in teaching or not teaching moral values, in rewarding or punishing, in supporting or diminishing dissenting thoughts, in determining the health and longevity of our families and our world forward. conversation we've been having so far, the different approaches to influencing humanity, touches upon the great question of our human existence. Are we grounded to God's inspiration of absolute values in our life? What these values are and how they are to be understood and effectively determined through our life? Or are we subject to the whimsical notions of relative morality, stemming from the changing and uncertainty of man's mind, mood, and behaviors, subject directly to the influences of outside, contentious, malevolent forces? Do we really think man alone is the measure of all things, without the providence and wisdom of God? Do we think man alone is the source of our reality? Do we believe man alone is the singular agent of change in the world? Do we hold our appeal to man's reason alone? Or is God the measure of all things? Is God through man's heart, God through nature, God through worlds unseen, the source of our being and the avenue of our appeal? Are our fundamental and foundational values and inspirations in our soul from God, divinely established, resonant in our hearts, principle in our conscience, absolute and unchangeable, not conditional by man's opinion, not excusable by time, place, or circumstance, shaped and established by God for the true benefit of humankind, and a firm foundation for society and all peoples? Or are our human values only of man, beliefs lacking an ultimate basis with no appeals, values that are changing, fickle concoctions of man's human conditions, emotions, and circumstances, subject to varying conditions and unstable passions? Are we to believe our fundamental moral values are from man only, absent God, absent a higher truth? Are we willing to accept a shifting sand as our foundation to morality? Are we willing to submit to the ignorance and whimsical passion of man as our barometer of what is right or what is wrong, what is good or bad, truthful or false? Are we comfortable with the constraint due to the limits of man's knowledge, man's prejudices, his inward greed, his mind only? Theodore Roosevelt a century ago commented, "To educate a person in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to society." Pearls of wisdom, not by a philosopher, but by a faithful, earnest soul. He knew then, as we emphasize now, failing to educate on absolute values, moral values, is to allow menaces to grow among us. It is in fact what occurs with relative morality. Menaces have been and are now being created among us. Let's take a moment to consider a real-life example of absolute versus relative morality. This is an actual example that occurred in America during the latter part of the 20th century, and many would offer still plays out in our society to this very day, especially in the world of politics, law, and in many instances the business world. Is a person who practices the following a moral absolutist or a moral relativist? Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Cut off the support network and isolate the target from sympathy. Go after people and not institutions. People hurt faster than institutions. This is cruel, but very effective. Direct, personalized criticism and ridicule works. Saul Alinsky's 12 Rules for Radicals, rule number 12, and he's a moral relativist. Alinsky died at the age of 63 from a heart attack near his home in Carmel, California, on June 12, 1972. Shortly before his death, he had discussed life after death in Playboy magazine, March 1972 edition. These are his words. These are the aspirations of a devout moral relativist. He doesn't seek or recognize God. Instead, he seeks a destiny in hell, the opposite of God's and foundational values of good. And in his Playboy reflections, we can see firsthand the conceit of man, where a dying soul thinks he's the measure of all things, thinking he'll organize the souls in hell. You think? While nearly 4 generations ago, Theodore Roosevelt correctly captured the essential truths of human values, we witness in Saul Alinsky's life dark aspirations. We meet the menace Roosevelt warns us about, the human being devoid of education and learning moral values, and following only his mind. A human being who follows a path of his own making, and it's not a path to God or eternal life. But as Saul Alinsky testifies himself, it's a path to hell. A thought about purity in life. A full glass of water can be 100% pure, glacial pure. However, if one were to slip just 1% of poison into the water, it makes all the water no good. So it is with evil. So it is with the fraud practiced by relativists. They don't hand our children a glass of 99% poisoned. That would be too obvious and revealing. Instead, they hand out just 1% of poison here, 2% there, not noticeable, but deadly in time. How would you assign Hitler to moral philosophy? He was an atheist, a believer in the occult, pathological and responsible for killing millions. Certainly not a moral absolutist. How would you assign Mother Teresa? A believer, devout to life of the poor and powerless, charitable and loving, a source of inspiration and love in the world. Before you are two ends of the moral continuum in life. Absolute morality at one end, wherein God is paramount and love is supreme, or at the other end, moral relativity, where man is the measure of the world and his hate runs over humankind with blind ambition, cruelty, and death. Consider the answer to this question. When we push God out as moral relativists would have us do, what do you think fills the void? Well, it's certainly not positive values. It's certainly not absolute morality. I think we know the troublesome answer. We've just seen it in the relativist life of Saul David Alinsky, and Hitler at the extreme end. In fact, we've seen it throughout the history of man, and unfortunately, we see it today. Moral relativism fills the void. Moral relativism eagerly swarms in when God is pushed out. It has always been this way. And so long as we push God out, there will always be the encroachment of moral relativity onto humanity and our cultures around the world. The fact of the matter is, the truth is not complicated. God has made it simple for us to perceive and understand and prosper. Some say it's self-evident to us when we see it and hear it. We believe that. In fact, you have to work hard to push God's truths away and block love in the world. Moral relativity is fine with doing so. However, absolute morality is not. God's truths look out to us in the purity of a child's eyes. In their gleam we see the power. In those eyes we see the projection of God's love and God's hope. They are eyes which acknowledge truth. They are eyes which know God. And in our world today, the competing contention between absolute morality and relative morality continues to play out. And we are hopeful, of course, for absolute morality to win, and we are forever advocates for God's truths. However, we are realists, and we don't bury our head in the sand to live in the delusion that everyone thinks and acts in the interest of humanity. We know they don't. We are students of history and acute observers of society around us. We see, feel, and more importantly, understand the conditions we are up against. Further, we recognize vastly different moral philosophies lead to very different value sets, which in turn lead to opposing human decisions and drive conflicting actions in our human behaviors. Moral philosophy does not sit idly on some bookshelf. Moral philosophy, by nature, is energetic, and it seeks to engage the world of people in all societies. These philosophies, although opposite, each representatively are active in seeking a home in the hearts and the minds of ordinary people, and just as directly penetrating the social institutions which shape and influence minds, decisions, and behaviors. The moral philosophies seek to grow deeply in our institutions, with the principal motivation to root beliefs and values into those institutions, for the express purpose of projecting those beliefs and values back into the general population, and importantly, to embed within the institutions so as to find the safe haven and pass from one generation to the next. And in America, we see moral philosophy underlining and melding into political ideology, and we see ideology expressing in political belief systems, and subsequently political expression in society. This is a good point to introduce our next presentation, where we'll be exploring how moral philosophies of absolutism and relativism cross over into the political ideologies in America, to shape and influence our society and institutions in many divergent ways. Understanding this crossover into the political spectrum of thought and action is fundamental to understanding any comprehensive view of contemporary society. So, please go to the next presentation, presentation number 5, a crossover to the political spectrum.